my truck right now, getting ready to go into a school music recital thing here. So, so yeah, you won't have to listen to me quiver as you guys talk about my experiences with the help from Jessica and things like that. So.
Only good things, only good things.
Yeah, no, good. All right, well, without further ado, Jessica, I will kick it off to you here. Yeah, glad people are joining, and we've got it recorded now, right, Tammy? So we will share, but ask away, and she is one fantastic resource here.
Thank you. Have fun tonight.
Thanks.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
So my name is Jessica, and I am a pelvic floor therapist. So number one, if you can't hear me or you can't see something I'm doing, just let me know. Number two, I tend to use my body to demo a lot, especially when I'm doing virtual stuff. So nothing wild and crazy, but just a heads up. And if I get very nerdy, just yell nerd, because sometimes I go off on tangents because this stuff is really cool to me, and I am very passionate about it. So most people don't know, they either don't know they have a pelvic floor, or if they do, they don't really know what it does. So the pelvic floor is actually the bottom of the core, right? So the pelvic floor, we say pelvic floor and core again because people don't know they have a pelvic floor. But when we talk about it, it actually is the bottom part of the core. So if we were to look at what our core is like, we've got the top, which is our respiratory diaphragm, the bottom, which is our pelvic floor. Our obliques make up the sides, with the lowest and most deepest, most core sitting muscle being the transverse abdominis on the bottom. We have the rectus abdominis in the middle, which is your six pack. And we have multifidi down the back, which sort of make up the back of the canister. Now, so I'm going to kind of, there's three parts to this, and it will kind of sound like I'm going off a little bit, but it will all come together. So the core, when we inhale, the respiratory diaphragm moves down, right? It doesn't, that's not never going to change. We all inhale, respiratory diaphragm moves down, exhale, it comes back up. So our job, what we can manage and move, is the pelvic floor. Okay. So, and I'm sorry, I did kind of jump into this without like doing tons of introductions about myself, but I kind of long-winded, so I'll throw things in as we go. So the main thing to know, and one of the main things I want you guys to take out of this, is most of the issues with pelvic floor, low back pain, chronic knee injuries, dealing with plantar fasciitis, begins with a mismanagement of intra-abdominal pressure. Okay. And I know this kind of sounds a little woo-woo, right? Because I, for years, was a pants peer. In my early 20s, this is pre-kids, I dealt with infertility, I dealt with low back pain, I've had prolapse, or I have prolapse, I dealt with, tons of this type of pelvic floor stuff, having no idea that it is never normal to pee yourself. Never, ever normal to pee yourself. Please, if somebody says, well, doctor says, or so friend tells you I've had kids, or I'm just getting older, you should never be peeing yourself. I just would have saved myself many years of peeing myself. So, I have been there, and when I started deep diving into all this, what actually got me into it was I love to run. And after my first baby, I started getting plantar fasciitis, and I was really frustrated because I wanted to get back to running. And a friend of mine said, I went to a pelvic floor therapist, and she changed my life. And I was like, what is this? And I'm an occupational therapist by trade. So I've been a therapist for 23 years, right? I've been specializing for the last four to five-ish. So, I mean, I didn't even really know a lot about it. So as I started deep diving and went to a pelvic floor therapist, the big thing that came up was breathing. And I remember being like, well, that's kind of silly because I can run marathons. So I can clearly breathe fine. Okay. Rongo bongo. So just remember at the end of this, that just like the respiratory diaphragm is on our inhale moves down, on our exhale returns to a resting position, we can't change that. We can also not change the fact that we have to manage intra-abdominal pressure. Okay. So we'll kind of revert back here. So I'm telling you, this stuff works. You just have to, it's a change of several things that we're we do that we don't even think about through the day. So again, as we inhale, respiratory diaphragm moves down. What we want to happen is we want the pelvic floor to yield to that, okay? We want this to be a nice, smooth motion. For many of us, what we're doing is we're holding tension in the pelvic floor, right? So if you are always sucking it in, if you are always nervous about something, if you have a lot of stress in life, the chances are is that you're holding tension. If we hold tension here, when the respiratory diaphragm moves down, this is what we get, a mismanagement of intra-abdominal pressure, right? That pressure has to go somewhere. For women, we often see leaking more commonly than with men because we have a vaginal opening. With men, we tend to see a lot more hernias. They're displacing where they're managing their pressure. If you've ever known anyone or had a back surgery or a back injury, they'll always say, you know, when you bend over to pick something up, don't hold your breath. Why is that? Because that pressure has to go somewhere, and that's where we get the slipping the discs or the bulging discs, those type of things. So managing this is going to help to the rest of the body to function the way it should. Okay, so when we breathe, inhaling down, exhaling is a return up. I was saying that if we're mismanaging, Jackie, you were on already, right? Yeah, okay. Like I just saw you come up, I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry, I was just, I was eating, so I had my camera off.
I just want to make sure totally fine. You guys can shut cameras off, that's all right. So now when we talk about the pelvic floor and the respiratory diaphragm and pelvic floor working together, we have to have a neutral posture, right? If we don't have a neutral posture, these guys can't work together. So where I start with most people is looking at their alignment. For many women, and this is not all, but generally, women tend to do this, right? We tend to do this, A, because we've been in heels in our life. B, it's much more aesthetically pleasing to do this than this, right? How many times has somebody said, posture, keep your shoulders back, that type of thing. And what happens is when we do this, we no longer have the ability for the pelvic floor and the core to connect. So what happens is we have, again, an anterior pelvic tilt, and this starts to happen, right? The pressure is mismanaged. Oftentimes for men, what we see is this, right? So we have more of that tucking of the butt. We're not using the glute muscles, which we're not using in either of these sort of end range positions. But we often see this. What we see is a belly here, because when we are tucking here, we're usually gripping with our ribs up here to hold ourselves up, right? So now we're mismanaging the pressure because now it's going down. So for men and women, if you feel like you have this belly, right, that is not like, it's not, you don't have a ginormous belly, but you feel like it's this hardened belly that you feel like you have muscle, but it's never going down, probably there's a good chance that you're mismanaging your intra-abdominal pressure. Now, if we are mismanaging the intra-abdominal pressure, several things can occur. For women and men, there's incontinence, there's issues with bowel. I see for most men, I see for erectile dysfunction, the hernias, I see them for chronic low back pain. Women, I see lots of low back pain, pelvic pain, pain with sex, difficulty reaching orgasm. And then, like I was saying before, just the things that are chronic, like knee pain or ankle sprains, things like that, they're all connected up into the pelvic floor. And the reason is because the pelvic floor is our center, right? So if that isn't stable, nothing around it is going to be stable. So we're going to fall into these patterns. I think that the pelvic floor itself is made up of 14 to 16 muscles, okay, depending on how you divvy them up. I kind of explain it like a trampoline. If you think of the muscles themselves, which is sort of like a bowl, right? If you think of them as the mesh on the trampoline, and you think of all the insertion points as the springs, and if you notice, all of these muscles insert somewhere in and around the pelvis itself, right? Again, pelvis is our sort of the center point or base of support in our body. Now, also what attaches here is glutes, hamstrings, all the big players. They're also coming up and around through here. So now you're thinking, okay, all those springs are in, and then you have the legs on the trampoline, which are your legs. Now, I want you to think about what happens if 2 of those springs are loose, right? What happens if there's a weak side to this pelvic floor, or this pelvic floor is tight? That trampoline is going to start to adapt. Now, it might work for a really long time until it doesn't anymore. So eventually something has to give. And what I find with pelvic floor injury, what I find most common is with our bodies is that we sustain an injury, especially for athletes. We sustain an injury, and what is the first thought? How do I get through this and get back on my feet as quick as I can, right? So we will work every angle around that ankle sprain. Now what happens as our whole body starts to compensate? The trampoline compensates, right? And what I find is that we never come back to that initial injury. We've figured out how to get around it, and now we're back at our performance level, but we've never come back to find out, do we really strengthen, or do we tighten those springs again, or do we just tighten things around them? And that's often what happens with the pelvis, is that something is taking over. So we get people with, a lot of SI pain. If you have old tailbone injuries, I find I do a lot of work around tailbone injuries, and it helps to reset people. So, the pelvic floor is sort of responsible for all the things that we don't like to talk about, right? But also those are oftentimes just indicators that your body's giving you that something's not right inside of there. So there's some kind of an imbalance in the pelvic floor. Okay. So pelvic floor, get stuff in here. Okay. Now, bladder here, vaginal opening here, rectum here. This is legit how close they all sit within your pelvic floor, okay, within that bowl. And for men, it's the same exact thing, obviously minus the vaginal opening. Prostate's up here, okay? What happens, some of the things that I see is, say somebody has recurrent bladder infections, right? Or your issues with the bladder gets inflamed. What happens is it starts to push into the tissue here, right? And it can cause issues with constipation. The reverse can also happen. So now we're having issues with constipation, which can eventually start to affect our bladder. So that's sort of another little kind of side note that goes along with all this. So that sits into this, deep into this pelvic floor. So there's not a whole lot of extra room. Okay, so now that you kind of know about the sling, so now we'll go back to the breathing. And we've talked about how the core and pelvic floor need to work together. In order for them to work together, we have to have good neutral alignment. Okay, so what I find most common in athletes, men and women, is that anterior pelvic tilt. I've found that we are progressing with something and our core isn't quite keeping up. The lower part of our core isn't keeping up with what we're doing. So now the last part of this is sort of, let's talk about breathing itself. Now there's 3 ways to breathe. There's breathing through upper chest, right? That real shallow. We see that really frequently with people with anxiety, respiratory illness. If there's a bear chasing you, it is an excellent way to breathe. Highly recommend it. It doesn't take, you're just here, right? But if we never come out of this, we're causing neck tension. We're never working our diaphragm, right? We're never strengthening our diaphragm, our core. We're never increasing our power. The next common breathing pattern that I find and that people know about is belly breathing. Now, belly breathing is really, really great for calming the nervous system, massaging the internal organs. But what happens is we'll learn about it in a yoga class, right? And it feels really good. So we just kind of make that our default breathing. Nobody ever tells you any different. So the main thing that we work on with pelvic floor, again, the core, is working on a 360 breath through your rib cage. So what we want is the rib cage to open up side to side, front to back. Okay, we want the whole thing to expand. So the first thing I look at when I see someone is posture, and then I look at what their breathing strategy is. Many of us are really good at the rib flare, especially if you've had kids. When we have kids, the angle of the infrasternal angle here, I can't make it with my fingers, kind of like this, right? increases to allow room, and the ribs come up to allow room for baby. And along with the fact that the organs kind of go up. So I see this really common postpartum, and then we never kind of bring the ribs back down. So once we're recovering, we get back into the things we were doing, and nobody talks about how to re-engage the core the right way, right? You just kind of figure it out. And for some people it works, and some people, we have a really hard time. So one of the things that I would have you guys try doing is taking your hands and putting them on the side of your rib cage and really squeezing, giving it a push, and then trying to really thinking, I want to breathe my hands away. So you want versus, right? Or going right to your belly. Think about, and this is what I love about this stuff, it all makes sense. The diaphragm has to move down because it has to move out of the way to allow the rib cage to expand. Why do we want the rib cage to expand? Because that's where our lungs are, right? So when we're going down to our belly or up in our chest, we're never expanding here. We're never, again, never strengthening the core, never getting that power. We're mismanaging our pressure. So thinking about when you inhale, we're inhaling out and then letting it settle back down. And that's one of the first strategies that I work on, again, for directing that breath work, is trying to get movement. And it's sort of why the rib cage doesn't have, isn't tied down to anything, right? It's sort of freestanding in the front because it's meant to expand. So when you go away from here tonight, you're probably going to try to think about this. You're going to be like, what did she say about breathing? What way am I supposed to go? The way that I remember, because I think oftentimes we think when we inhale, the respiratory diaphragm comes up, right? It just kind of makes sense. Think about when we inhale, we want that rib cage to expand. And that means the diaphragm has to get out of the way, right? So inhaling, diaphragm moves down. Now, remember, we talked about in response, as the diaphragm moves down, pelvic floor should yield to that also. So when we are always tense in our in our pelvic floor, what's happening is we're never letting our body know that it's okay to relax, right? And I think for a lot of us, we do it subconsciously. Again, we tend to hold, we just tend to suck it in. We hold, for men and women, a lot of tension there, right? Because it's kind of a guarded spot. So if I was to make a bicep, right, and hold it here all the time, and I had someone come up and hit it, when they hit it, that bicep can't get any tighter to resist that hit, right? So it's going to let go. The same kind of principle applies to the pelvic floor. If we're holding it like this all the time, so say it's an elevator and there's 10 levels, and we're holding our pelvic floor at a level 9, when we go to cough or sneeze or jump or run, or we do something that increases the demand on the pelvic floor and core, that pelvic floor has nowhere to go. So when I go to sneeze, the pelvic floor has no more levels to go up, right? It's already at the top. So what does it do? It lets go and comes back, because this is the only place it knows. It only knows level 9, let's say, right? So most women, when they leak, they think that their vagina is too loose, right? I've had kids, I'm getting older, all these things. When in fact, for 75% of women, their pelvic floor there's too much tension. They're holding it too tight. And I'm careful to use the words tight and loose, but for all intents and purposes, you're holding, right? So one of the first things that we have to work on is teaching, or I work on, is teaching people to sort of feel what it feels like to let it go and to move it back up. And that's a really, really hard thing to do when you've been holding for a long time. Okay, so again, if we're holding really tight, no matter what we do, we're mismanaging the pressure because we're not letting that air come up and down. Now, there is the other side of it. Oftentimes after a hysterectomy, a prostatectomy, those type of things, there is incontinence because we've taken sort of, if you think about one of the organs, we've taken some of this stuff out, right? The prostate, or we've taken out the uterus, something like that. And now the pelvic floor has more room. So now we have to work on actually getting it to lift and strengthen so that it will support and make up for that space. So there are different things, but at the end of the day, we all have to be able to relax it and lift it to meet the demand. So you know, I teach people when they come in that, you know, if your elevator, so if you're when you wake up in the morning, say you're laying down at night, you know, your elevator should be at level 0, right? I mean, for all intents and purposes, our core and pelvic floor is always working because we're always breathing. But when we're resting, there's no demand on it. We shouldn't be feeling it. Say we sit up on the edge of the bed. Well, now we're at a 1 because we have some gravity, we have some things pulling on us. We're now go to a 2 because we stand up. Now we start walking around, we're at a 3. Now we're, you know, picking things up. Now we're at a 4 because now we're reaching out of our base of support. So that intensity starts to increase, right? So now you think about the intensity. If a bear is chasing you, right? Now we need to be on, okay? If, you know, you're standing in line at the grocery store, if you're driving a car, there's no need for your pelvic floor to be, that elevator to be at level 9, right? It needs to know how to come back down so that when we have a demand, a sneeze, a cough, we lift a heavy weight, we're running, we are biking, that we can engage that pelvic floor to meet the demand of what's going on. Does that sort of make sense? Okay. Again, if it's not making sense, or if it's not coming together, let me know. So now another piece of this, and this is what applies to you guys quite a lot, is that ability to engage the transverse abdominis, which is that deepest lower core sitting muscle. If our posture, if we do not have a neutral alignment, right? So if I was to put my arm at length and say make a bicep, I can't engage it from here, right? I can't make a bicep from here. I've got to be able to move through the full range of motion. The same sort of thing applies if I'm here. I have got that transverse abdominis on stretch. It's really hard to engage from this point. Okay, so again, we're thinking about achieving neutral, and the test that I generally do for that is you find your sort of your hip bone, right? Ball and socket, place something with something heavy on the end. Now, again, I like this posture, right? This is where I kind of came from. So if you notice, the buckle is way forward of my ankle. So my neutral posture, I have to shift way back here. Okay, so for a lot of you, if you were to try this, you'd shift and you'd be like, oh my God, I'm gonna fall over backward, right? And it's a subtle shift, but it's a shift back. But the reason for this is we want you starting to feel that posterior chain fire up. Again, when we do this, we're not using the muscles that we should be using in order to hold ourselves up, in order to do all of our daily things. I know my head's cutting off, sorry, but you get the idea. So, you know, thinking about moving back, and as we move back, now we remember, oh, how do I offset that feeling of falling over? Coming forward. And for many people, it makes them feel like they're actually like this, right? When they're not. What we're doing is we're coming out of this, okay? And we're almost cutting here. So shoulders can still be back. Chest doesn't need to be up. Okay, we don't need this. So that's a major part of getting the body in alignment. Now, once we're in alignment and we take a big inhale, pelvic floor should relax. Now, this is the fun part. On the exhale, we should be able to, what some people would consider like a Kegel, right? You should feel a contraction. So if you were to take an inhale, on the exhale, you should feel a lift of your pelvic floor. So if I told you to what does it feel like to hold back gas? And this applies for men and women. The idea is that you should feel sort of a clenching of the anus, right? You feel posterior, sort of the back. You feel this area with a contraction. If I said to hold back urine, the idea is that you'd feel more clench or more shortening or contracting in the front part of the perineum. Okay. So we're here, this is the front triangle, the more superficial part is responsible for opening and closing, bowel, bladder, sexual function. The posterior muscles, sort of this triangle, are the back real deep muscles, and they're responsible for the lift.
Sorry, did you say you feel the release when you inhale or when you exhale?
When you inhale.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so when you inhale, you want to feel this stuff relax down. And on the exhale is when we want that to contract back up. For a lot of people, it's opposite. Yeah, and then this is where it gets, yes.
That's what I was noticing. That's why I asked.
You're probably doing, especially if you're paying attention to it. Yes, it's interesting. For men, when I say lift or contract the pelvic floor, you should see penis scrotum lift. Okay, much easier to tell. Women, part of the challenge with pelvic floor is I can't see it. So I'm using all these wonderful analogies to get you to connect to your pelvic floor, right? So what I usually tell people is for women or those with vaginas, I say, think about you're picking up a blueberry with your vagina, right? So you won't look at a blueberry the same, I'm sure. So you'll inhale, and as you exhale, I want you to think about starting the exhale with your pelvic floor, vagina for women. For men, think of the penis scrotum. What you should feel is an inhale, exhale. You should feel a lift and a sinking in of your belly and sort of coarsening of your muscles. Now, one way to tell if you're able to do this is to do a double leg lift. 99.9% of the people I've seen, high level athletes, still do not automatically engage the way they're supposed to in order to do a double leg lift. So for most people, let me see. What we'll see is a double leg lift that looks like that. Can you see how I'm pushing out here and pushing down my pelvic floor, and I've got a big old arch under here. And again, I'm exaggerating just so can you guys see that? Is that my back far enough?
Yes. Yep.
Good, thank you. So, excuse me while I move my penis. So what all day, I take these things everywhere. So one thing what we want to work on is inhaling. So we inhale, I'm thinking ribs. On the exhale, we're lifting the blueberry. And we want our core to, so we want it to sink. And you can feel your transverse abdominis if you were to put your hands right by your low hip bones. You would feel them come on. So if you cough or talk or you like push out, you'll feel them come on. If you kind of feel there. So the idea is we want them to come on without bulging or pushing pressure down. So we inhale, exhale, lift the blueberry. Now, once this guy is on, and the reason we start with the pelvic floor is because as we're lifting it in, it brings us into a slight tuck, right? An ever so slight tuck. And that tuck aligns us to allow our transverse abdominis to come on. And that's kind of the trick. So a lot of us will bypass the pelvic floor and we go right to here, right? And so we've got really strong upper abs gripping. What happens if our upper abs grip first? Pressure goes down, and now we're getting this again. Okay, so we are very tricky at trying to fool our body to manage pressure. So when, the end of tonight, try a couple of things, try a double leg lift, right? See what that feels like. The other thing that you can do is blow up a balloon. When you go to blow up a balloon, you should feel, and for some people this will be automatic, they'll feel this. For some people they won't. Most people won't. Most people will feel, as you blow in, you'll feel a downward pressure and out. And that's what you're taking your intra-abdominal pressure, and that's how you're stabilizing. You're kind of bulging and bracing out and down, right? When what should be happening is you inhale, as you exhale into the balloon, it should be, everything should be corseting. So when I have the live sort of in-person trainings, I go through a lot of this stuff so that you guys can feel it and actually feel like, oh, and a lot of people just have no idea, right? And what I find now is that the amount of power that people are getting start to turn on their transverse abdominis and the pelvic floor is like huge, right? All of a sudden they're aligned. We're not having the back pain. Now we're firing up our posterior chain. So we're not depending on the knees, the feet, the fascia to all take over, right? Things are starting to actually work in the manner that they're supposed to work in. Okay, so how's everybody doing? Any questions? I know I kind of went everywhere, but anything kind of coming up? Now,
Yeah,
Hang on.
actually, this is Emerin, and Adam's right there. Yeah. All right. So, no, this is like great. And so I'm wondering, what kind of, like, how do we strengthen that? I mean, identifying it, but then it kind of, the next steps are going to give us just some ways that we can start, on like floor work or something to start engaging that, to get it
Yeah.
back working.
so the one thing I hesitate with, and this is what, so I'm gonna give you an example. So Colin comes into the office and I'm thinking, what am I gonna do with this guy, right? I mean, clearly he can do all kinds of things. He doesn't have a problem with anything pretty much functional. So he comes in, and when I said, he said he gets this, issue with his left hip from a labral tear, and he's got this cramp that kind of takes him out of the triathlons, because he can't shake it out for a couple of miles in the triathlon in Hawaii, I think, right? So he's been in the trials, and he said, it takes me 2 miles to kick it out. By the time I kick it out, I kind of lost my placing. Well, when I'm looking at him, and we've been through this so he won't mind, he is like this, just, right? And I said, well, I want you to relax everything. He goes, okay. No, like, I want you to let that go. I am. Like, this was on for him and has been on for him constantly, right? Constant ab gripping. Down here, not much going on. And then as we're talking, he says, well, yeah, I don't really love to strength train because it hurts my back. But I'm pretty tall. And I'm like, of course he doesn't like to strength train because he doesn't turn these on. So what happens is his back starts to hurt him because he has no core stability. He has nothing holding his base of support stable. Once we stabilize this, everything else will work around it. So the reason that I go through exercises and stuff, but it's important that you are able to get it. Do you know what I mean? That you're able to feel what it feels like, because the other piece that happens is then say you understand it and now you're turning them on and holding them on all the time. Well, now we're leading to pelvic floor dysfunction because we're not teaching the pelvic floor to lengthen and relax, to shorten and contract when it should. So the basis of what I would recommend first is that you try the double leg lift, you try belonging into a balloon, you kind of look at your posture and see where those things are at. And then from there, kind of figuring out, okay, what's off for me? What do I feel like isn't stable? And normally what I back people down to doing is I generally don't have anybody do like hollow holds or double leg lifts because I found most people can't do it, especially not repetitively, right? Because you're just starting to brace because this gets really weak. So I'll have people, I encourage people to bolster their head, especially if they have an anterior pelvic tilt, because it helps to bring the ribs down. Because again, if we go to the ribs first, so when you're doing ab exercises, right, oftentimes people say, okay, put your back to the floor. Get the back to the floor. In order to get the back to the floor, we take the ribs and we go like this. Well, now we've already created pressure down. Now we're already out of a chance to engage this down here. Okay, so in thinking about some of these things, we work on inhale, exhale, and then once I'm here, being able to, without the hips rotating, without changing the breath. So in other words, without having a shift that goes like this. So I will see often people will go inhale, exhale, and then right at the end of it, they'll get ready to lift their leg and they'll go, and they'll switch it up on me. Okay, so again, thinking about holding here and then one leg, then the other leg, and then you work up to one leg, down, down, and then you work up to this. But it is, for most people, it's very hard to specifically contract the pelvic floor and make sure you're keeping that contracted to go through this whole thing. Yeah, so those would be some of the things I would start with, but a lot of it is also making sure everything is coming together. I see a lot of women post pregnancy with C-section scars. And if you've never had anybody mobilize your C-section scar, mobilizing that takes, I can't tell you the amount of things that have been relieved from that. I had one lady that her left shoulder stopped hurting her, had been hurting her for 20 years. And I was like, yes, great. Like, you know, but there's such a fascial restriction that we get into. Women that have had kids, there's sort of this thing called a birthing pattern. For most babies, when they come out left and LOA, left occipital anterior. So the way they come out and down, the way they come out ends up kicking the tailbone to the left and causing a lot of people to end up with like right SI issues. So things like that, and having a tailbone that never really reset itself, right? Getting in this birthing position that we just manage. So those type of things, again, tailbone injuries that I've seen, a lot of people that come to me, they just kind of come in and go, I've seen every specialist, you're my last hope because somebody told me to come see you and I don't even really know what you do or what I'm here for. That's most of the time what I get. And we start to peel back the onion. And most of the time it's, you know, I'm working with a gentleman right now that he's had this hip limitation for years. He was a snowboarder. He's kind of one of those thrill seekers as a younger guy, you know, crashed his bike and skateboarded and had lots of falls and all these things. And part of what I do, and this is not for everybody, but I do internal assessments and I do internal release work. And we do internal release work, and his hip mobility is pretty much back. And this is, we're talking like 20 years of not having hip mobility. Releasing muscles from internally has been really amazing for some people. And the cool thing about the pelvic floor is it's not like when you go for a massage where like this is the sore point. Most of the time it's this tension point that's held because of trauma, and not even bad, just trauma you don't even think about, or stress, and then old injuries that were never healed. And I start to let go of the tissue, and it's not something I have to go back and let go of again. It just kind of goes, holy crap, I didn't know that was even doing that. And then once I let that go, the rest of the body starts to like get into this flow of, oh, okay, now I can move in the ways I needed to move. What else do I want to say? So that was kind of a long answer, sorry, to your question about giving you exercises to do. One thing I did, and I talked to Colin a little bit, like I am always more than happy to, if you guys have a time that you kind of get together to do a small group, something like that, where it's a little more hands-on so you guys can understand what I'm talking about. Because the thing with you guys too, the thing I love about athletes, right? You guys are really strong and sometimes annoyingly strong, right? Because you have these patterns that you've developed to get you through everything you need to get through, okay? And then, so it's part of it is sort of backtracking those patterns and figuring out, because my solution is never, you have to stop working out, never, ever, right? Because I will tell you for myself, as I remember after I started delving into all this and thinking, I'm like a mess everywhere. I don't even know where to start. So I was like, okay, I'm just gonna start with my breathing. So I started with the breathing, and I remember the day that I was running on the treadmill, and I had been working on my new way, right? Trying to keep my pelvis aligned and all this good stuff. And, you know, as a new mom, I had 45 minutes maybe, and I wanted to just get a run on. I wanted to sweat it out and like, you know, get my sanity. And I started a little bit at a time. I would run in this new way so I could get 3.5 minutes out, and I'd be like, well, this hurts. This is ridiculous. And so then I'd go back to my old way and just finish what I had to do. And then over time, eventually I remember the day that I went back to my old way, which was my comfortable way, and it hurt. And I was like, well, I guess if I'm going to do one way or the other, this better way doesn't hurt. It's just I'm not as strong in that position, right? And that was kind of a big aha moment for me, like, okay. And then again, I started to, realizing after kids, nobody ever tells you how to turn your core back on, right? So you kind of go from this really extended core, and you go from being now, because baby has brought you further forward here, So now you've had 9 months of sort of shifting this way, and then you go back and they pat you on the bum at 6 weeks and say, go ahead, you're good to go, right? And again, if somebody that's active and that's an athlete is like, I'm out, I'm going. I mean, as soon as I was cleared, I was like, I'm going for a run. That was it. And so then you just start to do it, right? You start to build up and you never realize that there is a missing piece that's holding that pelvis stable. Not to mention you've already also like, the pelvis has already like done this and this and, in these weird things. So that's another thing I work on is with women that are currently pregnant and preparing for birth, because baby is the one that does the work. My job is to make space in the pelvis. So I take any of those limitations and we work on making space so that when it's time for baby to come, the pelvis can move in all the ways it needs to move. So we don't have a labor, I always give this example, and I don't discriminate against babies here. So think about, the alignment thing we talked about, right? Now, what if baby is coming down, right? And we have an anterior pelvic tilt. Have this, right? Pelvis is tilted this way. Again, I'm being very dramatic with this, but baby's coming down. Well, baby's stuck in labor. Now I'm laboring for hours. Why am I laboring for hours? Because baby is stuck on my pubic bone. Because I prefer that anterior pelvic tilt and all of my tissue is in that position, right? So instead of, and it's also partly, a lot of his knowledge and explaining to pregnant mom, let's try to move your pelvis so that baby has an easier time coming through, right? So that's kind of one of those examples of some of the things that we do. But that just applies again, and people will say, well, my pregnancy, gave me all these issues. And a lot of it is that those were the pre-existing compensatory strategies you were using, and now they're coming out. Because now we've had all these changes hormonally, the relaxin in your body, everything is sort of letting go, and we never really build it back up. So there's that tinge. And it's, for running, lifting for you guys, there is a different way to engage abs, right? So pelvic floor has two sides and it has a front and back. And so when you're swimming, you're thinking about your, that reach that occurs, right? And so the pelvic floor needs to be able to fire on both sides, right? So for a lot of people, like with Colin, we talked about, because he has an old shoulder injury and the labral tear and all these things, it's like he prefers a breath to his right, I think, like every third breath, right? Well, that makes sense now, all the things that are going on in his body. Because what happens? He goes, comes up and, I'm not a swimmer, so comes up and takes the breath here, but now the body is just used to this pattern, right? And so now I see the abs do this. And so as I start to release one side, it's like the other things get kind of like, oh, I don't really know what I'm doing. And so we see changes throughout the whole body. But in the end, just the amount of people that I've just said, the amount of power I have now is incredible, because you're starting down here, you're getting that push, the glutes are coming on, your hamstrings are coming on, you're not depending on these little muscles, TFL, piriformis issues, all those things that start to take over when the glutes aren't coming on. And it's not that they don't work, because you have strong glutes and you wouldn't be able to do the things you do, but they're not coming on at the right time. And now what are we doing? We're just falling into this hinge point, right? This instead of this becoming our hinge point and our strength point, everything comes from here, right? And this becomes our hinge. And that's where I see a lot of injury, and that's kind of where I start. Yeah. Well, I hope some of this is helping and interesting. And like I said, some of it is, doing hands-on. There's a lot of those like aha moments. It's hard to feel these things, again, because of pelvic floor, we don't know. It's not like I can say, well, you're not squeezing your bicep all the way, right? Everybody's like, oh yeah, I think I feel it, but like, what am I really feeling, right? I don't know what you're talking about, lady. Picking up a blueberry, I have no idea what you're talking about. So, thinking, the doctors still prescribe Kegels, the problem with the Kegel is you're doing this, right? The idea is that you contract and let go, contract and let go. Well, somebody that leaks, right? What's the worst thing they can do?
Contract it.
All they're doing is making it tighter, right? So and again, I found that, you know, so many, and it's not a dig to professionals at all. I just think that people don't really understand it and know about it. And I mean, gynecology, urology, PCPs, back doctors, chiro, all these people, they're not really aware it's there, right? So I get people that come in and go, well, the doctor told me I should just keep doing my Kegels, and you know, and now knowing what I know, I'm like, yeah, you know, no, let's not, you know. So again, it's kind of teaching people that it's there, how to engage it, and then once you can engage it, you know, there's so many things that kind of, for me, there's so many things that just resolve. And, you know, so then people say, well, how do we implement it, right? Like I can't, when I'm walking, I can't take between every step, inhale, exhale, corset, all these things. So, you know, that's impossible. And so what happens is you start to do it at times when you're going to get out of bed in the morning, right? When you're driving, when you're standing in line at the grocery store, you're checking in, where's my posture? How am I breathing? Because as you start to change it, then the body likes whatever's efficient and easy. Right now, it feels like work. So the body has no interest in implementing it. But once you start doing it and the body's like, oh, I feel power. Oh, I can pick this thing up easier. Oh, I can move better. Oh, I'm not peeing myself. It goes, oh, there's another way to do this. And it starts to implement it. For me, for running, I always give the example that, you know, right now I'm running, I'm feeling strong, I'm running great. When I hit a certain point and I'm pushing too hard, I will start to leak. Now, I'm not as worried about the leaking, which I should probably never say that aloud, but what it means for me is that my form is breaking down. And if my form is breaking down, my hips are starting to tilt, right? My form is breaking down. That means I'm going right back to the back pain, plantar fasciitis, all those things start to fire up. So for me, that means my pelvic floor isn't there. Now, sure, I could keep going, right? My legs can take it, my breathing can take it, but my pelvic floor isn't supporting me, isn't holding me where I should be. So I have to back down. And so then I start to work at that threshold, right? That threshold becomes my new place. And then eventually I can push past that and then everything's back on board. But that's sort of the first thing to fall apart. And so things like CrossFit, I think CrossFit is wonderful. I have no issues with it. But when people are starting to lift heavy and fast, one of the biggest culprits is any of these movements, right, is the initiation of the movement. So where does the movement start for most people? When you do a deadlift, it starts here, right? We pick up and then we come up. When really it should start here. So as you get heavier, you know, you're lifting and it's like, okay, so we go into this and then we kind of come up. And so we're just reinforcing that pelvic motion. So that's kind of an example of some of the things that I'm looking at. And that's how little that can be, that little minute thing. And again, it works for a really long time until then it doesn't.
So this is Emerin again. I have another question.
Yeah, please.
Well, actually two things. One is, I was doing PT last year and the trans abdominal muscle, really focusing on that for lower back pain. And it was really interesting how weak it was.
Yeah.
Because I was doing some of these, but adding that pelvic floor component was not part of the conversation. And so I think kind of combining those mental processes to better understand how those two things work together is just a comment. But then my question is, as an older woman, how does like approaching menopause or being in menopause, how does that affect how some of this stuff works? I mean,
yep. So
I'll preface this that the reason I know about pelvic floor is from, reading up on kind of physiological changes with menopause.
Yes, and that's so with menopause, we often see the tissues start to change, right? So because of the hormone imbalances that occur, you're not getting as much testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, there tends to be shifts in that. But with most everyone, the vaginal tissue starts to change, and the elasticity that comes within the vaginal wall can gets thinner. And so if we are not, if you are mismanaging your intra-abdominal pressure, this is kind of when we can start to see signs of prolapse. Things like incontinence, again, because we're mismanaging pressure and that the tissue is not coming back to its normal state. And so we oftentimes with menopause, we work with finding the hormone imbalances and doing creams or supplements, because dryness occurs. So there's always, not always, most always an issue with dryness during sexual function with that type of stuff. And also that if you are an athlete and you're doing heavy stuff with heavy demand, again, if you're not managing your pressure, you're going to start to feel the effects of it on the pelvic floor. And I think that's part of why a lot of women do really well for a long time, then they hit menopause, like, oh, my back hurts, and all these things are kind of coming in, and it's just our body's changing. The other thing that's interesting with menopause is, so this is what I've read with studies and heard from actually a lot of my clients, is that women's bodies were built for endurance. So when we hit menopause, we tend to lean toward endurance type activities, like longer on the treadmill, longer on the elliptical, types of burning things, because there's also weight gain that can come with menopause and all that. One of the ways that is recommended that you train is with heavy weights and doing more strength training and heavy lifting, because that tends to speed up the metabolism more than the endurance stuff. But again, now with that, I have a lot of women that come in, like, I felt great, it was going great, and then things started to go down here. And again, it was because they weren't probably they're not managing pressure correctly, and the tissue just, again, it's not going to bounce back as quickly and as efficiently. And if you're doing it repetitively over and over, we're getting problems with that. Does that answer some of the question, or some of kind of what you were?
Yeah. It does. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and kind of the club that we have, it seems as though generally we have younger women that are under 40-ish, or it kind of skips some of those young child years, just because it's really hard to be a triathlete and get all the training in, and have young kids. And then it picks up again,
Yes,
like in that 45, 50 range, which is the age I'm at. So, I've definitely seen some, especially lower back and some other things that I've had to kind of figure out. Yeah, there are definitely times when I feel like I'm kind of falling apart.
Yeah. And just the changes are very frustrating, especially when you're somebody that's active and you're doing all the right things. And it's like, I've treated my body well, I'm trying to take care of it, and it's kind of like just, flipping me the bird and doing what it wants. And so so a lot of it, again, if the pains and the aches, there's going to be hot flashes and stuff, but there are definitely, a lot of tension starts to develop in the pelvic floor, because there's a lot of stress that comes along with that, right? And then you have these periods that are willy-nilly kind of come, or now they're gone, but then tissue changes, everything kind of changes. So we work a lot on strengthening that tissue, the area, and the surrounding muscles, so that even if the tissue isn't quite as strong, the surrounding muscles can take up some of that slack.
So for a lot of us, I'm thinking I need to spend some time with you. That's what I'm thinking right now, because I have a lot of those things you've talked about, and I need some help. So I'm going to write this down, and then I'm going to post this in our group chat so that we all have this. What is the best way for people to either schedule time with you, like to make an appointment? Do we go online? Do we call you? Do we email you? What's our best bet?
I would say, so you can go online onto my website, but I have availability. I'm very flexible. so what you'll see when you go to book is like 9 to 3, just because of my kids. But if I know ahead of time, I can do Saturdays, I can do evenings. I'm available. I just have to know ahead of time in case there's other commitments. Like my husband likes to play horseshoes on Tuesday nights. That's a whole nother thing in itself. Anyway, but I would say call or email is probably the best way. To just kind of, that way you're going directly to me, and then we can kind of set something up.
Okay. So in the invite that they built for us, they didn't
Yep.
put any of that information. So all they've given us is Pelvic Connection.
Yes.
So
So my
do I-
website is thepelvicconnection.com.
Okay.
And my email is jessica@thepelvicconnectionnh.com.
you said at the Pelvic Connection or just Pelvic Connection?
Jessica@thepelvicconnectionnh.
Okay, got it. All right, cool.
And a lot of times too, so the insurance issue comes up. I do not take insurance because I have did that for years, and I just have no patience for somebody telling me what I can and can't do with a patient. If I need to spend a long time with you, I spend a long time with you. You know, what I write in my note is what I write in my note for me. I don't need anybody to approve it. I could go on these tangents for hours, but what I want you guys to know is that I am always willing to negotiate price. I have, you know, I do take HSA, and then I can do super bills for a PPO if you have like an out of network person. And again, please, like I just can't, I don't have the manpower nor the time to go through insurance. So if you, I believe everybody should be able to have this. I have tons of packages. You know, I probably shouldn't advertise this, and I'm a terrible salesperson for myself, but I make up packages every time somebody comes in. Like, let's talk about what you're able to afford. You know, it's, please just don't back off because of price. I really want people to know that. You know, I'm always happy to do groups. I do a group usually once a month for 4 weeks every month. And it's mostly people kind of coming in, not knowing what it's about, but I advertise it as back and core strengthening. And then, because when I say pelvic floor, people are like, oh, I don't pee myself, I don't need that. You know, and then when people in 9 times out of 10, people go, oh God, I had no idea I had some of those things. So again, if, you know, where you guys all sort of train in the same type of things, you know, just mention it to Colin, and I'm happy to set up times. If any of you live close together, I'm very flexible with all this stuff. You know, I'm happy to do some traveling or whatever to do any of that. And then, what's the other thing I'm going to say? Oh, the other thing that, because you guys are involved with athletes, and you know, you guys have, some of you have children, there are a lot of, well, there's several studies that have come out recently that talk about around 30%, and I assume it's much more, of high school and college athletes are women, female athletes are having incontinence issues. And I know some of the theories are like with runners, I've heard many of them say, well, you know, if you pee yourself, it means you worked really hard today, right? You really pushed yourself. They're not going to talk about it much. So I'm trying right now, kind of working on trying to reach out to coaches, you know, to coaches at high schools, and just talking to athletes. And I don't expect anybody to go, oh, you know, that's me. But my hope is that I can put the seed out there. So maybe a couple of years down the road, they say, Mom, you know, or their coach, I remember this girl saying I really shouldn't pee myself. You know, it can lead to injury and this can hurt me more, or those type of things, and starting to get some of that awareness out there. You know, that if your pelvic floor isn't strong, it's, you know, if you're peeing yourself, it's not because you're pushing, it means you're pushing hard, but you're not strong enough to be there. And it's starting to educate some of the coaches to be listening for that, you know, because by the time, you know, for me and my age, you know, forever, it was always a joke. Oh, I peed my pants, you know, got my pads on. And, you know, we need to make that just known, especially starting young, that I also truly believe that when girls go to their PCP, or their, first gyno appointment, that the doctor should be very much using a mirror and saying, these are your parts. These are your parts. This is what it looks like. Great, right? We're done, right? Like, instead of it being this sort of, men can look at their parts. They're right there, right? They would know if something looks different than it did yesterday. We have no idea. Most of us don't look at anything until we have our baby, and that is not the right time to be looking at that for the first time. So, really starting to, and then this isn't me saying like, we got to be out and about and free as a bird. I'm just saying that I think that if we knew a little more and we're a little more comfortable with some of our parts. And so that's sort of another area I'm trying to get this out to people younger, because I think it's important.
Makes sense. Cool.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're
Yes,
very welcome.
Thank
Appreciate your
you. So we just threw it out to 100+ people. So who knows what's going to happen next?
Awesome.
You are going to hear from me pretty quick, because
Hey, yes, I would love to. Yeah, just again, I'm very easygoing, and I just because I've seen so many cool results. I can't even tell you. Like, part of this for me in the beginning was like, this is craziness. What are we talking about? Breathing in my pelvic floor, and it's made such a huge difference. So yeah, so I definitely, any questions, conversations, if you're not sure if it's right for you or anything, or you hear people in the group talking about it, always call. We can chat with it. We can figure it out.
cool.
Very
Good. Well, we are
Yeah,
over,
thanks so much,
we're over on
Jessica.
time.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah.
You guys, anybody have any more questions? Are you guys good?
No, this is great. Thank you.
Thanks, you guys, for your time. I appreciate it.
Right, cool.
Thank you so much.
All right.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.